you. Please. So, yeah, I think this is a topic that is on everybody's minds, depending on what smartphone you own. How many people out here have Huawei, by the way, in terms of smartphones? Anybody? A few people? Oh, just a few. Wow. Okay. So the good news is you'll still be able to use your Huawei smartphone because U.S. actions, despite trying to contain Huawei and limit its global reach, you'll be allowed to upgrade your Android operating system on that in the near future. And I'll try to explain, why we're here and how we got here, and a little bit of what to expect going forward. So I work in political risk consultancy, so we consult with companies that are on all sides of these tech issues and 5G issues, carriers, vendors, et cetera, trying to understand the way forward on here. And in terms of this tech Cold War, I sort of helped co-coin that term along with Paul Moser from the New York Times. And again, it was just describing what was going on. We weren't trying to create a meme and that drives the discussion, but we are really in this sort of tech Cold War. It's not a very perfect analogy, but I think it works here just because the world is sort of divided into camps. And Europe, for example, is in the middle of this thing and may be forced to choose sides or make complicated decisions because of the U.S.-China relationship. So I think, why should we care about this? Well, in the short term, we have a lot of problems coming out of this technology conflict, things like reduced investments flows globally, and particularly from the U.S. to China, China to the U.S. We have a lot of restrictions on U.S. technology for specific companies like Huawei. And then in the medium term, and actually happening right now, we have a lot of supply chains, for example, moving out of China, moving from China to Southeast Asia to Mexico. A lot of companies that we deal with are grappling with concerns over supply chains. And then the long-term implications are the problems of sort of decoupling. How far the U.S. and China go in sort of decoupling their economies, and particularly their technology sectors. And then, of course, things like AI and 5G come into play here. So I thought there was an interesting moment in the recent New Economy Forum last year where a former Treasury Secretary, Hank Paulson, talked about the real effects of this. He was looking at sort of the worst case scenarios, but he talked about an economic iron curtain. Some people have called this a sort of digital iron curtain that's falling between the U.S. and China. And so that's sort of the world we're in here. So let me just explain how we got here. So quickly, China, of course, has long aspired to become a technology power and to reduce its dependence on Western companies for a whole range of things. So Xi Jinping, when he came to power in 2012, has really focused on the technology sector and on, in particular, things like cyber issues, the internet. And he uses this term in Chinese, Wangluo Qianguo, which really means build China into a cyber superpower on par with the United States. And so this is one of the sort of backdrop for a lot of this, that China has emphasized the technology sector and tried to develop core technologies across the board, semiconductors, software, operating systems, obviously smartphones. And so this is something that has drawn concern in the U.S. So basically, a couple of actions and programs that set off alarm bells, both in the U.S. and in Europe, of course. The Europeans, the Commission has been concerned about these things. So particularly, a big national IC investment fund set up in 2014 that Chinese companies were using to purchase foreign semiconductor companies, including in Europe, or have tried to. And then we have the Made in China 2025 program, which targets 10 large sectors, technology sectors, including semiconductors, things like electric vehicles, and the government is providing a lot of subsidies for these. So this has generated a lot of concern in the US and Europe. And then in 2015, we have Belt and Road, of course. Europe's on the other side of the Belt and Road, starting in China. And then a lot of concern about the close relationship between the Chinese state and the civilian sector. This comes into play quite prominently with Huawei. And then in 2017, the release of this big national AI plan, artificial intelligence plan, that calls for China to dominate or be a dominant player in artificial intelligence by 2030. So all these things have generated alarm bells. Some of these are longer-term factors, though, in terms of getting to this situation we're in now that we call the US-China Tech Cold War. So there are a lot of structural issues that date back to China's admission to the WTO and the sense that China hasn't lived up to its obligations, et cetera. And then I think more recently are these policies that I mentioned under Xi Jinping that have, with the focus on technology and the concern that China is becoming a real peer rival of the United States. And then, of course, the Trump administration comes into power in 2016 and has adopted a very confrontational approach with China. There's something called the Washington Consensus. If you haven't seen the speech by Vice President Mike Pence last year, that the Chinese called the evil empire speech. But that's a list of a litany of all of China's sins over the last 4 or 5 years. And so the US approach on China has become extremely confrontational. And that has then actually become a global issue now, particularly when we talk about companies like Huawei and technologies like 5G. So one of our challenges in understanding the US situation is there's lots of different players, lots of different focuses within the US government on China. So, for example, there are the people like the president and some in the private sector who are focused on the trade deficit with China. But the real focus recently has been on trade and the trade structuralists who want to change China's economy and force open China's market for things like cloud services, for example. And that group has been, of course, engaged in a very complicated negotiation with China for almost a year. But then, as soon as the trade negotiations went off the rails a little bit in early May, the other two groups kind of came to the fore, what we call the supply chain nativists, people who really want to separate these supply chains that have focused on China for almost 35, 40 years, where companies have optimized particularly their technology supply chains in China. There's a feeling that now in the US, that's a national security problem. Too many things are made in China. So that group, for example, has seen the tariffs related to the trade dispute as in part focused on US companies to force them to move some production out of China. We've been seeing this happen over the last 6 months, and it's accelerated. And then finally, there's the group that views China as an existential threat. I think in Europe, that view of China is a little bit less held, but there's a strong group that includes people like Steve Bannon, and formerly advisor in the White House. He has said things like, killing Huawei is more important than getting a trade deal. So he represents a view of China that is implacably opposed to Western values, and this is shared by a number of members of the administration, and accounts to some degree for the concern over companies like Huawei and who's going to build the next generation of the internet and mobility services. So, in DC, these groups are all sort of vying for primacy here, and that accounts for some of the perception that the US doesn't have a very coherent strategy on China. So I spent a lot of time in Europe talking to European officials, and they're concerned, for example, that Trump's comments at the G20 that seem to reflect the position of going easy on Huawei might mean some backtracking by the US after months and months of the US pushing Europe to either ban or restrict sales of Huawei equipment in Europe, for example. So that's a big issue. So in general, when we talk about this Cold War, it really focuses on a lot of different things. So there's the trade negotiation-related tech issues, including things like market access that I mentioned, and things like forced technology transfer and cyber theft of IP and subsidies under programs like Made in China 2025. But then there are these other issues like US concern about technology control, the concern that China's getting too much U.S. technology, and either illicitly or through elaborate joint venture deals that involve tech transfer. And then there's increasing concern about supply chains, as I mentioned, that too many of these are focused in China. And then there's the sense that I think my introducer noted that the sense that U.S. and to a larger extent Western countries are in this long-term struggle over the technologies of the future, like AI, quantum computing, 5G is really in here, super computing, high-performance computing, and things like advanced semiconductors. And so that, even if there's a trade deal, for example, all of these concerns we don't think will go away because there is this narrative that we're in the struggle, and also that China's using these technologies in ways that Western countries don't like. So China's using artificial intelligence and facial recognition, for example, to control the minority population in Western China. That's gotten a lot of press recently. And then there's concern over things like quantum computing that will allow China to break encryption down the road, and that will be a threat. So it's not just about the technology, but sort of how it's used by China versus how technology is used in the West. As I said, even with a deal, this Cold War will rage on. But let me skip forward to in the interest of time, to 5G. So this is the backdrop for the issues around 5G. Are the ones I've just mentioned here, and then it's really in the last year that 5G has become such a big focus of everybody's attention. Probably if you asked people a year ago, what is 5G, the average person, they would maybe not even know. And even in industry, the 5G has really become such a focus of attention in the last year. It's amazing how fast we've gone from the eve of a 5G rollout, and all of a sudden now we have all these political questions around 5G, concern about companies and where equipment is being manufactured. So in the US-China competition here, then there's the US, as I mentioned, has been working over the last 6 months to try to get allied countries in Europe and in Asia to consider banning Huawei. There's just a concern about the company's business practices and its ties to the Chinese government. So this campaign has really picked up in the last 6 months and culminates essentially in this action against Huawei in early May. So the action that the US government took in early May was to put Huawei on a list, sort of a blacklist, that prevents them from buying certain types of US components, particularly semiconductors and software. So luckily, the person who has the Huawei handset, there was an exemption for existing handsets that were manufactured before May 16th. So those can be continued to be upgraded, but anything sold after May 16th is subject to restrictions from US suppliers. So this has created a huge concern within the US industry. For example, that eventually Chinese companies will essentially consider US suppliers unreliable and will design out things like US semiconductors, and this will eventually erode US leadership in things like semiconductors in particular. And then things like the Android operating system, of course, that are in Huawei phones. Another concern at Google that again, if Huawei decides to develop its own operating system, which it is doing, mobile operating system, that it will also erode Google's leadership in mobile operating systems. So the tech Cold War has really become now the focal point of sort of the strategy around 5G going forward. And this is the analyst action. So we're right now in a little bit of an interesting moment where the U.S. government is trying to decide how to move forward on this, how much to restrict Huawei, how much to allow. So probably, for example, they'll allow supplies to Huawei's consumer side for smartphones, tablets, laptops, but probably will restrict the supply for Huawei's infrastructure business, which is the underlying architecture of, for example, of both 4G and 5G in a lot of European countries, not just Europe, but of course Africa, Latin America, and other places. So the implications of that are really profound for all of you, because it may mean, for example, that the rollout of 5G is going to be delayed, because if companies, for example, in Europe have to tear out their existing infrastructure that's based on Huawei equipment, that's going to be very costly. One estimate from the industry association estimated that it would delay the rollout of 5G by as much as 18 months to 2 years. And so there's a lot of uncertainty in Europe among the carriers about which direction the US is going to go on this, because if they restrict this access to infrastructure, supply to infrastructure, this is going to have really serious consequences. And and again, delay the rollout of 5G, probably not just in Europe, but globally, because Huawei is such a key player in this. So that will mean that you won't be able to stream. In a football stadium, you won't be able to all stream high-definition TV at the same time, which is one of the promises of 5G, based on the infrastructure that 5G will allow, much more dense kinds of communications. And then, of course, there's the innovation on top of 5G, which everybody is eager to have, some more than others in terms of things like autonomous vehicles, smart factories, smart cities. So all of this will be delayed if the US action against Huawei is maintained. And that's, again, a really serious problem for a lot of European countries like Germany, where the auto industry is eager to get to connected and smarter vehicles, and 5G is a really critical enabler of those things. So the implications of the US-China conflict here, and particularly this action against Huawei, immediately globalized this conflict in a way that we still don't really know what the outcome is going to be. And of course, European governments are voicing a lot of concern in Washington. And then, of course, as I mentioned, US industry is very concerned about this going forward. So finally, what does this all mean? I just want to foot stomp here a little bit. I mean, this is a real. This Cold War is real. It's beyond the trade war that we're seeing, and it's probably going to lead to some fragmentation of the global technology ecosystem. And we already have China has a separate internet. They've already have a lot of censorship of the internet in China, for example. So we already have some moves towards sort of a bifurcated global cyber commons, if you will. And this, I think, the worst case scenario here, if it plays out, will lead to much more separated and sort of separate technology realms. As I mentioned, the delay of 5G is probably going to happen at this point, depending on the way the U.S. goes and the ability of Huawei to find alternatives. That's a big deal. And then, again, the U.S. may be considering actions against other Chinese firms in the near future. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of concern that basically the U.S. designs out China and Chinese components, and China designs out U.S. components. So maybe the big winner here will be Europe. And then finally, we have a top risk that we do every year. This year it was called Innovation Winter. And so the idea here is that all these things like separating supply chains, moving things out of China, all these things divert a lot of resources and effort. And then in the U.S. also, there's a lot of effort to restrict, for example, the numbers of Chinese students studying in the STEM fields. And so the sort of beneficial flows of people, goods, and investment are sort of under a lot of pressure, and this is going to impact the ability of companies to focus on things like innovation. So that was one of our big risks this year. It looks like it's coming true. And then, of course, who are the winners in all this? Or losers? I mean, there may be a lot of losers, as we've noted, but the winners are going to be countries like in Southeast Asia here that they're going to be beneficiaries of some of the supply chain moves. And then in Europe, the companies like Ericsson and Nokia, of course, will benefit to the degree that Huawei is limited in its ability to participate in 5G rollout. And then, again, I think I've been impressed so far with the vibrancy of the European tech industry and startup industry. So it's possible that as the U.S. and China are duking it out, Europe will have a chance to develop, and innovate in ways that will be of an advantage to European companies and ecosystems. So let me stop there. I think we have time for questions. I know we're running a little late.
So I'll tell you what, I'll ask you a question now. In the meantime, please use Slido. Just go to the TOA 19 app and click More, and then please put questions in. Pick Slido and pick Stage 2, and there we are, and they're all behind me. So we're rocking and rolling. What's your take on 5G's negative?
It's funny. That's always the first question I get asked. I've had this about 3 or 4 times. I think that it's tricky to say, right? There are a lot of organizations looking at this. There aren't enough 5G deployments yet to really study the sort of live 5G deployments. I think in the Netherlands there were some birds that were killed, and I think people attributed this to 5G, but there aren't, again, not a sufficient mass of, or density of 5G networks deployed to really understand this. Now, the frequencies that are used here are going to be much higher, but those frequencies, the higher frequencies, fall off. The power falls off quickly as you get farther away. So, I think the jury is still out on that one. But it's funny that maybe it's the same person always asking that question. But good question.
Yeah. And there's a question here on how the US can expect Europe's support in this kind of trade conflict, given what's happening in terms of closing off relationships at the moment.
Yeah, well, that's one of the big criticisms of the Trump administration is that in seeking to confront China for business practices and long-standing concerns, that the U.S. government should be drawing in more allies. And to some degree that's happened, but of course at the same time, the Trump administration is putting tariffs on European companies. I think that's changed a little bit over the last few months, and I would expect to see more unity of purpose here. But both Europe and the U.S. have different views. I think fundamentally of China, the U.S. again the consensus that China is an existential threat. I think Europe is a little more pragmatic in this sense and doesn't have exactly the same concerns about China, but is very concerned about Chinese economy and business practices. So.
How might this affect our lives or what we choose to do as attendees?
Wow. Well, again, I think that at a minimum, it should impact your choice of cell phone. I talked to a number of people, smartphone. I talked to a number of people before this who had decided to not choose Huawei because of concern over these issues. So that's sort of that's a fairly minor impact. I think going forward, though, I think as this conflict heats up and other complications come in, it's going to impact people's ability to to sort of keep, as I say, keep innovating and keep expecting your smartphone to get better and better, and it'll definitely push out that deployment of 5G. So if you're expecting to drive your autonomous vehicle or not drive your autonomous vehicle anytime soon, I think that it'll definitely impact things like that, and also a lot of other areas like medicine, remote medicine, and smart cities, which are going to be based on things like 5G technology.
So Paolo Triolo, it was very cool to talk to you about Sicily backstage and all sorts of stuff. A hyper-polyglot, the practice head of the Eurasia Group.
Thank you.
Warm round of applause, please, for this gentleman. Thank you very much.